Hi, and welcome back to the bench. My name is Shai with Resurrection Instrument Repair, where we revive your instruments from the dead, one solder joint at a time. Today on the bench, we have a very special amp in for repair, a Peavey 5150 that was previously owned by August Burns Red. My customer acquired this amp after Brett Ramble, the lead guitarist of August Burns Red, listed this amp along with some other pieces of gear for sale a few years ago. This amp was shipped to me for repair after my customer noticed that the amp was a little bit more noisier than normal and overall just wanted to have the amp checked out and gone through. Now that we have the amp open, let's get started. The first thing that I had to do was take care of all of this dust. I used a small bristle brush to gently remove all of the dust from the outside of the chassis. While dust may not seem like a big deal, excessive dust buildup can actually exacerbate things such as overheating issues, especially if there is a lot of dust buildup on the tubes, as the dust acts as an insulator, trapping and holding heat around the tube, causing them to run hotter than intended. Once I got the amp all nice and cleaned off, it's time to dive into the electronic side of things. The first board that I pulled out of this amp was the main board. Once I got the board on my bench, I took a few moments to look over it, and I was able to tell right away that this amp had been worked on before. This big blue Nichicon cap would not have come stock inside of this amp. I could also tell that this cap had been replaced due to the not so visually pleasing silicone job, which we'll touch base on a little bit later in this video. If you are following along at home, all of the products used in today's video will be linked in the caption of this video. After setting my soldering iron to about 650 degrees and tinning the tip of my iron, I got started by removing the original main capacitors. I very gently placed the tip of my iron on the solder joint in the cap. Once I noticed the solder starting to melt, I placed my solder sucker over the joint and clicked the button on the side of the solder sucker. This helps to remove a large majority of the solder holding the cap in. I then repeat this step to the other leg of the capacitor. Once I had a bulk of the solder removed, I then placed my solder wick over the solder joint before placing my iron on top of the solder wick. As the solder wick heats up, I gently move my iron around to soak up all of the residual solder that might be holding the cap in. Once all of the visual solder was removed, I then placed my iron on the legs of the cap to heat them up so I could very gently use a small flathead screwdriver to lift the legs off the board. But before I actually remove the cap, I flip the board back over and notate the polarity of the cap, indicated by the band of arrows on the side of the cap. These arrows tell you which side of the cap is negative. I then grab a new cap and measure the placement of the legs. Once I get the cap all nice and centered, I bend the legs and check my placement again, which I was not very happy with, so I removed the cap again and readjusted the legs of the capacitor. If you're super picky like me, you might have to do this a couple of times until you get it just how you like. Now, one of the most important things when recapping an amp is matching the polarity. If we look at the cap we removed, we can see that the arrows are telling us that this leg is negative. But if we take a look at the new cap, it does not have a band, but rather a series of plus signs on one side of the cap. This indicates that the leg closest to the plus sides is positive. It is incredibly important to not install the cap the wrong way, as it can and most likely will blow up. This can cause an incredible amount of damage to you or your amplifier. Once I am satisfied with the placement, I gently bend the legs of the cap to help hold it in place when I flip the board over to solder. Next, I gently flow some solder over one leg of the cap, then gently push down on the top of the cap while the iron is still on the joint in order to reflow the solder and tighten the cap down to the board. After that, I then flow some solder onto the other leg and flip the board back over to check my work. Once I make sure I'm happy with how everything looks, I flip the board back over and snip the remaining parts of the capacitor legs off. Now, you might be tempted to just chuck those capacitor snippings into the bin, but don't. These leg cutoffs are actually what I and most technicians use when rebuilding traces, so be sure to put them in a little bag and save them for later down the road. I then clean my solder joints with a little isopropyl alcohol, and that is it. Now I repeat this process to the rest of the caps in the amp. Once I got to the original IC cap, I removed it from the board and saw some electrolyte had leaked out of the cap. This is exactly why I recommend my customers preventatively recap their amps every 10 to 15 years, as electrolyte is an extremely corrosive substance and can cause a great deal of damage to your amp, including damage and degradation to the traces, damage to surrounding components, and corrosion damage. On top of that, caps that have or are in the process of failing can also explode, which can cause major damage to your amp. Now, when it comes to removing electrolyte, it is absolutely crucial that you neutralize the acid before wiping it away, as if you fail to do this, residual electrolyte that is not visible to the eye may still remain and go on to cause issues. I spray a generous amount of acid neutralizer into a jar and use a small paintbrush to place the neutralizer on the areas that I see electrolyte. Now I let that sit for about 3 to 5 minutes. After letting it sit, I then use a paper towel with some isopropyl alcohol to wipe away the acid neutralizer. Then I continue the installation process of the cap. Here we have another cap that is puked out electrolyte onto the board. Here's a good shot of what the electrolyte looks like. It normally is a yellowishy, orangish color, and oddly enough smells like fish when it gets hot, which can actually help tremendously with the troubleshooting process. If you notice your amp putting off a fishy smell when you play through it, then you should turn the amp off, as that is your caps. Just like before, I make sure to apply the acid neutralizer and continue the installation process of the cap. Now we're moving on to these larger radial caps. After removing the solder from the legs, I gently wiggle the cap side to side to help it pop off the board. And yeah, that is not what we want to see. A boatload of electrolyte. Let's pull these other caps and see what lies under them. Yep, that is more electrolyte. Normally, when one cap begins to fail and leak out electrolyte, all of the caps have or are close to leaking electrolyte. This is why I always encourage my customers to opt for a full recap instead of just replacing one capacitor. Now that I have all of the caps removed, you guys can see just how bad the electrolyte had leaked out of the caps. While this may look pretty bad, there are actually a few good things to note. If you look at the electrolyte, you can see that none of the electrolyte has come into contact with the holes where the traces are located. This is really good because electrolyte is notorious for causing trace damage and degradation. Just like before, I apply a generous amount of acid neutralizer and install the new caps. Now that I have finished replacing all of the caps, I turn my focus to some general service. The first thing that I do is touch up and tighten down all of the solder joints on the pots, jacks, switches, and tube sockets. I do this because these are the most physically used parts in the amp, making them most susceptible to cracking in cold solder joints. I add a little bit of solder to every joint on these components before going back through and gently laying my iron on top of each trace while applying pressure to the top of the component to ensure that it's nice and tight against the board. I then clean the flux off of the joints with some isopropyl alcohol and a small paintbrush. I continue general service on the preamp board by gently wiggling each tube side to side while pulling up slightly to pop them out of their sockets. Once I got all of the tubes out, I saw our last little electrolytic capacitor that needed to be replaced, so I removed it and swapped it a new one. Luckily, this cap was not leaking, so I did not have to neutralize any electrolyte. Once I finished up with that, I then sprayed some contact cleaner into each tube socket and used a small pin tool to clean the tube sockets. If you do not have this tool, you could also use a stiff pipe cleaner, or even installing and removing the tube sockets a few times to help distribute the contact cleaner in the socket. While I am cleaning the tube socket, I am also tightening the tube socket pins by using my tool to gently push inwards on the tube socket pins to ensure that the tube socket holds the tube nice and snug. Once I finish cleaning and tightening down all of the tube sockets, I then reinstall the tubes and move on to the power tube board. As soon as I got the power tube board removed, I immediately noticed that one of the traces of the tube pin was completely missing, as well as another trace was lifting. I built a new trace using one of the cutoff legs of the caps from earlier. After getting the trace nice and shaped to my liking, I installed it and cleaned up the solder joints with a little isopropyl alcohol. At this time, I also readhered the lifting trace. Next, I cleaned and tightened down the power tube sockets and cleaned the jacks and switches on the effects board. After I finished servicing the electronics, I began the reassembly process. I noticed some corrosion in behind the faceplate, so I removed the faceplate fully, and I'm glad I did, as the corrosion was quite a bit more than I initially expected. This corrosion was located in a small area. With this amp being an amp that went on tour, if I had to guess what most likely happened, is the guitarist may have sat a drink on top of the amp, and during a performance, the vibrations of the amp caused the drink to spill, and all of that moisture got trapped behind the faceplate, causing it to corrode. After getting all of the corrosion cleaned up, I then siliconed my caps in place, which I unfortunately don't have any video footage of due to my camera deciding to die even while it's plugged in. While I don't have any footage of this, I do want to mention a few things for the folks who are following along at home. When it comes to silicone and electronics, not all silicone is the same. In fact, most silicones that you find at your local hardware store is acetoxycure silicone. This particular type of silicone, alongside most silicones in general, contain and release harmful chemicals that can cause damage to circuit boards. You will need to find an electronics safe base silicone. I personally use ASI 388, which is linked in the description of this video. After I finished siliconing the caps down, I then reassembled the amp and got started on cleaning the knobs and buffing the pots and washers. After that, I then cleaned the cab, which you guys will see in an upcoming video, as well as biased the amp, which you guys will also see in an upcoming video very soon. If you guys enjoyed today's video of seeing this 5150 amp repaired and restored, be sure to subscribe for more. And if you guys have not already, you can follow me on all of my social platforms, which are linked in the caption, where I post even more instrument repair content daily. If you guys have made it this far into the video, comment something that you have learned from today's video or a topic you would like to see me cover. If you guys want to hear this amp up in action, just stick around to the end of the video for a short demo from my boyfriend who is having an absolute blast with this amp. Alrighty guys, and with all of that out of the way, remember, fix what you can, share what you know, and always play with your heart. We are all in this jam together. Until next time, peace.